Hello, and welcome to Beyond the Pages with Solution Tree. I am your host, Rob Meyer. This podcast is an opportunity for you to learn directly from Solution Tree authors, hearing their thinking, hearing their purpose, and hearing who they really are. You have the opportunity to hear actual voices behind what you are reading. In this episode, I had the esteemed opportunity to talk with Dr. Douglas Reeves and Dr. Robert Eaker, aka Dr. Bob. Doug and Bob are both authors of a litany of texts that have impacted the educational profession. In my own work, I have read, cited, and utilized the work of these authors. I know I'm not alone. It could be Dr. Reeves' Achieving Equity and Excellence, a personal favorite, or Dr. Eaker's A Summing Up, which has regrounded me in my own efforts as an educator. In this interview, we talk about cultural caring, the human side of professional learning communities at work. Doug and Bob give you additional insights into this timely publication from Solution Tree. Listen, learn, enjoy, and check out Cultural Caring. Hello and welcome Dr. Reeves and Dr. Eaker to the podcast.
Well, hello there. How are you?
I'm doing well today. Excited to meet with you.
Well, we're excited to be here.
We're talking today about Cultural Caring, the human side of professional learning communities at work, published through Solution Tree. But before we get into the book, let's get to know both of you a little bit more. So Dr. Eaker, most podcast listeners probably know who you are, as you have a storied history not only in PLC at work, but in school improvement and higher educational leadership. So instead of a full biography, could you give us a few highlights of your career or what you would see to be your career highlights?
Well, I really never see anything in terms of my career highlights, but I'm old, so I've had experiences. And I was thinking as I was driving over here to do this, that I've spent most of my career in some leadership position. I've over 50 years, but for everything from a squad leader in the United States Marine Corps to dean of students in a large high school and retiring as vice president and provost of a major university. And so I've had different highlights. I think the seminal point, I suppose, in my career was two, and that is when Jeff Jones purchased Solution Tree. Mm-hmm. It was just happened to be exact same time that Rick DeFore and I were publishing Professional Learning Communities at Work. And Jeff purchasing Solution Tree, I think Doug would agree with me that Jeff's an absolute genius at organizational marketing and planning and promoting and all that goes with that. I often joke that I think PLCs at work would still be stored somewhere in a warehouse had Jeff not bought Solution Tree. But of course, the actual main point in my career, I think, was when I met Rick DeFore in the 70s. He came to hear me give us a speech at the University of Tennessee. He was in the audience, came up, introduced himself, and we became great friends. And for 40 years, worked together as partners. And as the end note of that, when Rick was very, very sick and didn't have very long to live, I happened to be walking down the street in Key West, Florida, and I get a phone call. It was in the middle of January, and it was from Doug Reeves, and who said, "Hey, I just want to know how you're doing." And we chatted for a while, and that started a new partnership in my life. And I've always been appreciative of Doug's thoughtfulness and reaching out. The only person, by the way, who did that. So those are sort of the highlights of my career. Not much to speak of, but I was persistent anyway.
That's a great segue to talk to Dr. Reeves. But before we do that, I just want to reiterate the comment that you made about Jeff Jones buying Solution Tree and the importance, because as a practitioner, and I think a lot of listeners will be practitioners of the PLC at Work process as well, and just how impactful that work is in schools, in thousands of schools across the country and world. So it would be a shame if those books were still sitting in a warehouse somewhere. So that turn of events has impacted me, and I know again thousands of schools. Dr. Reeves, similarly, you have a reputation that's well known in our field. You're really known as a leader in taking research to action and helping us understand how we can implement those concepts in schools. What have a few highlights been in your career?
Well, first of all, I just need to admonish my friend Bob that there's no extra points in this class for Southern modesty. Um, he has had a profound impact, not just in the United States but around the globe for PLC at work, and Bob's influence is just extraordinary. With respect to my career, um, I'm I'm just a math teacher. I mean, I started uh, teaching middle school math with a lot of uh, uh, multilingual students, and I was so lucky to have them there. Then I started studying high poverty schools, and that's really what launched my career. So my career has been based on a deep inquiry into high poverty schools, and that's really what launched my career and launched Creative Leadership Solutions, advanced learning centers, and I've just you know my life has been one of better to be lucky than smart. I was just a lucky guy who was able to stumble onto the right kind of research that had an impact on people. So that's what I've done. I've published quite a number of books, many of them with Solution Tree, and I don't know. I I I think it's wrong to claim credit for stuff that you don't deserve because when you're a writer, you never know what's going to land. But I've been really lucky to publish with Solution Tree and to have some books that I hope had an impact.
Well, I would be here to tell you that they certainly have. And again, as I mentioned, just the ability in your writing to take concept to implementation and help us be able
Yeah,
to do that at sites in the K-12 system is needed and appreciated.
thank you.
Um, we're going to shift and start talking about the book Cultural Caring, the Human Side of Professional Learning Communities at Work. So let's get started with that concept. Dr. Eaker, what is cultural caring? What's this all about?
Well, it's certainly not a new concept. Uh, in fact, it's kind of amazing to me uh, that that a book like this I feel is even needed. I was thinking most of us, and I think most of the people probably listening in your who went to graduate school or even undergraduate school, particularly getting a master's degree and so forth,
Mhm.
we all had to study things like Elton Mayo and the Hawthorne studies, the Western Electric studies, and that goes back to the late 20s, early 30s. What do we find? Well, it's the human factors that really motivate people. And then I remember distinctly because I thought it was unique. Theory X and Theory Y by Douglas McGregor, and what kind of leaders do we need? Well, we need those kind of leaders that care, make people feel special. They're the ones that work. And of course, the seminal research of Abraham Maslow,
Mhm.
and I think his book was Motivation and Personality. But who doesn't know about the needs hierarchy? What motivates people? Well, it's those psychological needs. And so that led me to think about and reflect on PLCs, and because I had been such a, a part of that work, that I think over the last 40 years, we've done a really good job of uh, why this work is important. I mean, everybody knows why we need to improve schools, so that's not really been much of a challenge. And I think we've done an excellent job on the how to implement PLCs at work. We've had the PLC at work books, two on revisiting PLC works, four editions of learning by doing. So there's no shortage. I think we've kind of beat that horse to death. There's no shortage of how to do this work. So the challenge, it seems to me, is how do you motivate people to want to do this? And here are two key words: with fidelity and specificity. And we find a lot of people, a lot of schools who undertake this work because they're told to. In other words, they're doing it because of, uh, some authority figure has decided we're going to do this and tell people to do it. We try to manipulate it sometimes through reorganization, structural changes. We're going to change the schedule. We'll change or we'll retitle people. But when it gets down to it, when the bottom line is the difference between the high performing PLCs and the ones that call themselves PLCs are those schools where people feel, both adults and students, that we care so much that these kids learn, and we care so much for each other professionally that we cannot do this. Right? We just can't do it because we care too much. And so caring and creating a culture where we care, we do things because we care is, I think, the next huge, it's a huge challenge for people who undertake this work. Structurally, I think it's common sense. How to do PLCs, why to do PLCs. Great deal of common sense there. But getting people to want to do this and motivate people, the key to motivation is cultural caring.
I was just going to add a couple of things. First of all, when the history of education is going to be written for the 21st century, Bob is going to be in that pantheon along with Rick Dufour, Becky Dufour, and others. But I would also add the last article that Rick wrote, he co-wrote with me, called "The Futility of PLC Light." And what Bob just said is really profound. It's not enough to label yourself as a PLC. There's a dramatic difference between I want to be a PLC and I'm a PLC light. And there's a whole lot of people who are a PLC light. And so I think what Bob said is so profound because it is the difference of a school leader and district leader who will give the faculty the time and the opportunity to really make a difference. And I despair when I see people say that I'm a PLC, but here's 25 minutes that you can do it. It takes time and it takes effort. And Bob is absolutely right that we need to give it the investment of professional learning and time that it takes. And PLC light, I fear, as Rick did, that it is what predominates still the nation. The concept is great, but PLC light is still all over the place. I just want to say one more thing about what Bob said and that is the role of leadership. We know the value of teaching and teaching excellence, but if you don't have a leader who is willing to create the time and space for teachers to do what they need to do, then we're not going to be able to do what we need to do. So I just always respect what Bob says about the value of leadership, and as he said, he's he said 40 years. I think it's a little more than 40 years because he and I have both had more than 50 years of leadership experience. That's what it takes to make things happen in schools.
As a just a footnote to that, right before Rick passed away, Rick Dufour passed away, and I'm talking about just days, a few days before he passed away. I was sitting on the side of the bed talking to him, and we said, reflecting on our work, and we said, "Oh, what have we learned after these 40 years?" Then with 4 decades of friendship work, and I think quickly we both said, leadership matters.
Yes.
We have seen school after school after school try to organize themselves into school improvement. And while organization and structural changes are important and they're necessary, they're always inadequate. There's the human side of it, the caring side. And I want to say this about that because what struck me is anybody who reads this book who reflects on their own life will say, hey, the things that motivated me in my own life, personally and professionally,
Mm-hmm.
was when somebody made me feel special, made me feel
Yes.
cared for. It's a human aspect of this. And I just want us to realize that becoming a high performing PLC is much more than organizing and doing the right work. It's also making people realize why we're doing this is because we care for these kids so much. We cannot do it. We have to do it because we care.
Exactly.
I can take you to the spot in reflection. If you would come to my elementary school that I attended as a child, I can take you to the spot that a teacher told me that I was doing good work and I was a whiz in social studies. And he would told me that in front of the principal, and I was by myself. I can take you to the tile on the floor that I was standing on when Mr. Leonard Larson uh, told me that, and I became a social studies teacher. I don't think that's an accident.
What's amazing about what you just said is every person listening to this broadcast can tell a similar story. Every single one.
Absolutely.
In reflecting on the book, when I read that, I was, and I'd be interested in your responses to this. I think there's this idea in education that that academic outcomes and wanting academic outcomes for students and caring about them and tending to the whole child are competing forces. I think they're complementary of each other.
Well, I mean, think about this. Uh, this is one of the great ironies of my career is if you were to ask virtually every educator, the kids learn at different rates and in different ways. It's the one piece of educational research that everyone agrees on. I've never heard of anybody say, oh, no, no. I mean, Benjamin Bloom nailed that. But think about this. This is a piece of research that we all know, and we know from common sense, and we know from our own experience that kids learn at different rates in different ways. And yet we organize schools in order to have them learn in ways. It's based on the notion that our organization of schools is based on the notion that all kids must learn at the same rate. And if they don't, there must be some penalty, usually in the form of a lower grade. I have never understood that. And so a key piece of PLCs at work, and the piece that people often leave out in terms of PLC light, is this thing of giving kids, an individual kid, help, additional time and support, or if they're proficient, extending their learning, because not for state testing, but because we care for them as a kid. We care for them. And I think the piece I worry about we miss sometime, and I hope Doug and I address this over and over in the book, is we think of cultural caring in terms of motivating kids to do well in school because they know we care for them. The same holds true for adults. The key to student learning is adult learning. The key to student caring is adult caring. And that's what we've tried to address in the book. It's both of those things. That's why we named the book, by the way, or titled the book, Cultural Caring. We didn't say student caring, classroom caring, creating a culture in schools of caring.
Well, I must say that Bob just said in 60 seconds what would have probably have taken me a chapter to write. He's so thoughtful and articulate, and I really appreciate that. The only thing that I would add is that we really need to provide for our students and for our teachers. And what Bob said was really important. It's not just cultural caring for students, it's cultural caring for adults as well. That's the sort of thing that our country needs right now. And we have to, and let me just add a couple of footnotes here, because as a researcher, I always have footnotes. One of the things that is really important is that we need to recognize that there's a huge turnover of teachers. 53%. The latest research says 53% of teachers will quit if they could. In rural areas, 75% will quit if they can. So we need to be thinking not just about our current teacher resource, we need to be thinking about the next generation of teachers. And that's why Bob's legacy is so important, is to think about the next generation as well. So that's footnote number one. Footnote number two, it's okay to have kids deal with anxiety and stress. I want to honor Wendy Suzuki at New York University, who wrote this wonderful book called Good Anxiety, that it's okay. Too many of today's parents think that I can't have my kids face any kind of anxiety. Actually, yes, they do. They do need to face anxiety, because that's what's going to make them successful adults. And I just need to acknowledge that that we need to have better research like that from Dr. Suzuki, who really is bringing to the foreground the need for challenge. One of the things Rick Dufour talked about all the time was the need for both students and teachers to have productive struggle. So I won't go on with this lecture, but I do think these things are really important to think about, as Bob said, for both students and teachers.
Dr. Reeves, you mentioned a little bit about community there. I'm interested to hear how and why rather you designed the book in the way that you did. I think it's important to note that you don't just talk about classrooms or teachers or leaders, but you bring this concept of cultural caring for all the way up through governing boards, as well as to the community as a whole. And I'm sure there was a reason for that.
Well, there is, and I'll defer to Bob about this, because he has a lot of experience in governing boards and leaders. But I'm honestly very worried that too many people think that that kids need to be sheltered and they need to be protected. And the truth is, they need to experience difficulty. And I'm worried that at too many schools, kids do not experience that, or if they do, then their parents and their board members swoop in. I wrote an article. I'm sure your listeners have heard about social and emotional learning, and I wrote this article, said, let's put the L back in social and emotional learning. It needs to be learning, and it needs to be tough, and it needs to be challenging. That's why, for example, I think sports teams and drama teams and chorus teams are so great for kids, because they learn to struggle. Mm-hmm. And I worry that sometimes we lose that. And I should defer to Bob, because he probably knows more about this than I do.
Well, not really. Obviously, Doug's been one of my heroes for years and years. I just think the thing about starting with school boards, is every school I've done a lot of work with individual districts, mm-hmm. and I always insist on starting with the school board. What would make us believe? I mean, really, I think this is such a common sense question. Tell me what would make us believe that principals are going to care more about each other and their teachers then the school board cares about them. What would lead us to believe that teachers are going to care more about their kids than the principal cares about them? And so I've always thought of school improvement as a simultaneously top-down, bottom-up enterprise where caring, direction, stress. Doug, I was always amazed. Years ago, I remember reading about research at Harvard on the two kinds of stress: good stress, and eustress.
Absolutely.
So, who creates that kind of culture? Well, it begins with the school board, and some of the absolute worst modeling, terrible modeling, will be done at a school board level, expecting everyone else to model highly effective behavior. And so we start with the school board and the importance of them caring and supporting each other in this endeavor. It's called a board. It's not a collection of individual contractors here. It's a school board. We're going to create a culture of caring for each other and for everyone in this district. And then when you do that, you're able then to create that kind of cultural caring among all the leaders in the district, principals and others, and create that then within each school and each team within schools. And so the school board is just so critical. But Doug goes much beyond that, which really, when we wrote this book, he wrote this part, and I thought it was just so motivating for me. We need this in our country now, much less schools.
Yes, sir.
What would lead us to believe that we're going to have great schools of cultural caring when we have communities that are divided and divisive, and so it goes even beyond schools. It doesn't stop with the school.
Yeah, yes, sir.
It almost seems right now that communities are kind of almost enjoying that divisiveness. So we need to get back to caring. I would agree.
Well, there are people, I mean, let's face it, who get up every morning and they're getting dressed and shaven, and it's like, who can I confront today? There's a sort of motivational happiness that comes from confrontation with some people. I've never understood it, but I think it's true in some people's nature.
Yes, sir.
Let's shift a little bit and take a look at a couple of quotes from the book. So I'll give you a quote and then get a response from you, whether it's the rationale for the quote, explaining it a little bit more, diving deeper, whatever you think is appropriate. So Dr. Reeves, this quote comes out of the book. "The challenge in creating a caring culture is not one of convincing people that it is the right thing to do. Rather, the challenge is doing it, acting in planned, meaningful, purposeful ways with specificity and fidelity." This was mentioned a little bit earlier in the podcast, but I think it's important to highlight.
Well, that's very kind of you to identify that, and I need to credit Bob about that as well. It's about implementation. It's not about the idea. It's not about the philosophy. It's about implementation. I should also, I try to do my best to credit other scholars. Aaron Hamilton, John Hattie, and I wrote a book about implementation, and I think we really need to think about the idea. Bob's mentioned a minute ago about fidelity. It's all about implementation, and John and Aaron are the preeminent scholars in that field. So that is at least what I hope to say. I probably didn't say it very well.
Thank you. Dr. Eaker, we'll come over to you for this one here. I selected you for this one because it sounds a little bit like Dr. Bobism, I think. So we'll see what you think. "It's not kind for a leader to give false affirmation to a teacher."
Well, that really comes by Tom. Yeah, since Doug, he's so good at crediting people. I never forget. I spent a few years going up to Michigan State University. They had a Center for Research on Teaching. I got to meet and spend some time with Jerry Brophy, and that was about the time they came out, Tom Good and Jerry Brophy, on looking in schools. And one of the ways we communicate low expectations to students is when we congratulate them on inadequate or incorrect. Uh, and what could be it's almost insulting when you think about it. And the same is true with adults,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And so and here's the expert on this, Doug Reeves. This is why standards are so important. We create lots of winners and celebrate their success as we work towards a standard of care, a standard of behavior, not simply because people show up. And so the gist of that quote has to do with communicating low expectations through affirmation that's not earned or deserved. And everybody knows that, especially if you do it in front of a group. It's not what it does just, I mean, we forget this sometimes. We think about our interactions that we have with a single individual. The issue there is, what does it tell everybody else?
I just want to double check. Are you saying, Dr. Bob, that not everybody gets a juice box?
I'm saying that, yeah, that's right. And there was, by the way, I have this thing about the 60s, the 1960s. Um, I may be wrong about this, but other people, David Haberstram and other people have written about this, but I think that all comes from sort of the 60s. If you took graduate classes in the 60s, the gist was never confront anybody. A confrontation was a four-letter word, make people feel good. It's all about feelings, emotions, and making people feel good. Don't confront, don't whatever. And it's amazing how much of that still permeates many of our schools. If you can't say Rick before was a master example of this. He was so, he was a classic leader. I thought he was the best leader I'd ever seen. And he would single out individuals in faculty meetings and tell what they did that was so great. And he did that so that other people on the faculty would know, look, here's what
Yes.
what we're striving to become, just like this person. And in fact, here's one of my favorite stories about Rick. The head of the teachers union comes in to see Rick, good friend of Rick, representing the teachers one day, and says to Rick, Rick, there's some concern on the fact, this is a large faculty, over 4,000 kids.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of concern on the kind of permeating here on the faculty that you have favorites, that you're playing favorites with some of the faculty. And Rick didn't miss a beat. He said, Tim,
Yes.
absolutely. He said, I have favorites and I can tell you who they are. And he started naming them and why they were favorites. And so this idea of everybody, we won't recognize anybody if we can't recognize everybody is absolutely just based on a misunderstanding of human motivation.
Well, and I would just add to that, Bob, that the same applies to students. It's so important that we recognize excellence and we recognize resilience and response to adversity. That applies to adults and that applies to students as well. You reminded me just now of my other favorite Rick DeForest story of when people were disruptive in a faculty meeting, and he'd call them in and say, hey, this meeting was not very fun for you. It wasn't fun for me. So if you don't want to show up for the next one, here's six alternative duties that you can do.
Rick would constantly remind everyone that confrontation is not a four-letter word. Here's
Exactly.
the way we do things at our school. Here's the standards we have. And
exactly.
Now we do believe that, I mean, the key to this professional learning communities is the phrase "at work."
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
There were PLs, professional learning communities. We did not come. That phrase had been around. What was different was the at work part. What goes on in a PLC that's highly successful? How do they do the work? So it was written by practitioners for practitioners. You mentioned you're an associate. We have over 300 associates in Solution Tree. Every single one of them, a practitioner, has successfully implemented the PLC process. In fact, I am one of the people who sign off on every associate, and you can't be an associate unless you've been a successful what? Practitioner. And so it's we value, if we talk about school improvement, we have to believe in individual improvement.
Mm-hmm.
So we
Yes.
celebrate and recognize improvement, but not just general improvement, improvement towards a standard of
Yes.
behavior, a standard of care, a way we do things around here.
And honesty has to be a part of that. When I think about that quote, it's not kind for a leader to give false affirmation to a teacher. It's really, in my mind, about being honest to where we are and where we aren't. And I think people deserve that.
And that's really motivating for both students and adults to know that I can be better next year than I was this year. I will share with you a brief story of a woman in Connecticut who in April was talking about, I'm collecting my cards from my students, and she then said she was in her 39th year of teaching. This was April. She said, I'm going to retire in May, but in my 39th year, I'm going to be a better teacher than I was, last year. That's the spirit of continuous improvement that we want to see among every teacher, every administrator, every student as well.
Thanks for your thoughts on that quote. I'm going to give you one more as we go through the process here, and I think it fits with the previous quote fairly nicely. So the quote is the let them sink or swim approach is the antithesis of caring and supportive.
Doug, go for it.
Well, uh, all I could say is we all sink.
Mm-hmm.
We all sink. So what we want to do is let them swim, and not by giving them floaties, but by rather giving them the opportunity to swim. I'm a big believer in resilience, in perseverance, in all the things that students need to do, because that is what will support them throughout their entire lives.
There's nothing quite as uh, that makes you feel so good as when you feel you're sinking.
Yes.
You don't know which way to turn. You don't know what to do next, whether you're a student or an adult. And whether it may be your personal life, it may be your professional life. But somebody reaches out a hand and says, hey, I care for you. Let's talk about this. How can I help? And that's the key to student being a great teacher is how can I help?
Yes.
My favorite quote is in that book, but it's not by us. I put it, it just has such a profound effect on me. And in some ways, was what got me thinking about this whole topic. Maya Angelou said, and this is a rough paraphrase, says, people will forget what you say,
Exactly.
people forget what you do, but people will never forget how you made them feel.
Yes.
That is absolutely true for every person who's listening to this podcast right now. They can name people who had a profound impact on their life because of how it made them feel.
Mm-hmm.
When you gave the example of the teacher who congratulated you on learning social studies, you didn't feel great because he said you learned social studies. You felt great because he made you feel special.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
So true.
This is one more example of why Bob is a better writer than I am.
That's a, I can't tell you how that makes me laugh. I've looked up to Doug Reeves' writings for years, and feel so blessed that he called me that day in Key West, and we've written a number of things since then together. but that is just funny to me.
Podcast listeners, this is not on video, but there's the biggest smile on Dr. Eaker's face at the moment. With that, as we kind of close things out, I want to give you an opportunity to share a few more things. First, Dr. Reeves, is there any other message about this book and the idea of cultural caring that you think we haven't touched on that listeners should know?
Uh, well, I'm honored to be asked, and I would just say the following. Um, uh, there's a lot of emphasis on other things in schools these days, but culture of caring is missing. And now is the opportunity, as Bob and I have attempted to say, now is the opportunity to say culture of caring is more important than ever. And we need to call attention to our policymakers, to our parents, uh, parent parents and students that the culture of caring is more important than ever. So I don't know if I've successfully made that case in these pages, but I really do hope that they would consider that.
Dr. Eaker, would you have any message that you would want to share?
Well, I just think we're at well, it's kind of a sad time, really, in public education in the sense that ever since we had No Child Left Behind,
Mm-hmm.
we've had essentially, if you really told the truth, we have this idea of truth in advertising. And if we were absolutely truthful and said, tell us, what is the fundamental purpose of public schools these days? You'd say to have high test scores, to raise test scores, because it's essentially a culture of testing. And I might add, in many cases, a culture of toxic testing. And because of the pressures that this testing culture has brought on, there's tremendous impetus for people to try to organize their schools in ways that kids will have better test scores. What fascinates me is how what a failure that has been. I mean, the evidence is just clear, and billions and billions and billions of dollars on a failed effort that we continue to hope will work someday, I suppose. But what really seems to make a difference, I was really struck. Well, a person who had influence on me was Ron Edmonds and his work in effective schools.
Yes.
And I remember distinctly Ron's point was right before he died was, we know what works in schools. We know what works in schools that have high fidelity. Kids are doing well. Adults feel cared for. Kids feel cared for. We know what works. How many schools would it take we have over what? Hundreds of model schools and PLC model schools. So it's not like we have a lack of knowing what works. The issue, and there's where Ron Edmonds nailed it, is how do we feel about the fact that we're not doing it in so many schools? How do we?
Yes.
And so I am more and more convinced that we don't need more information about the structural side of school improvement. What we do need is a deeper commitment to the cultural side, the caring side, the human enterprise side. And there's no shortage of research on why this is important. We've known this. I mean, geez, just go to Deming, and the whole thing of Japanese management and teams and working together to support each other. So that it's not a lack of information; it's just a lack of commitment and being and finding those kind of people. I might add one last thing here. It makes this topic is so difficult. It's fairly easy to teach people how to organize schools in ways that are more effective. It's extremely difficult to find people who have the inner value system and personality and the belief system to make that work.
Yes.
Right? We have such a shortage there of those kinds of people. Those aren't the result of training. That's who we are as individuals. And so that's why it's very, very difficult.
Yes. Well said, Bob. Thank you.
I think that's a great stop to kind of place to kind of stop and drop the mic as we wrap up the podcast. I can't think of a better way to do that. So I want to thank both Dr. Reeves and Dr. Eaker for joining me. I hope all the listeners learned a little bit about cultural caring, the human side of professional learning communities at work, that you can find at many retailers as well as solutiontree.com. Dr. Reeves, thanks for joining.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Dr. Eaker, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having us, and thanks very much. I'm flattered. Thank you.
It was my honor to interview Doug and Bob on their publication, Cultural Caring, the Human Side of Professional Learning Communities at Work. They both shared insights into this book and beyond. I can attest that they are both educators who seek the best for teachers, titled leaders, our communities, and most importantly, the students we all serve. Check out Cultural Caring if you want to improve your own community, district, site, or classroom. We want the best results possible for students, but, as argued by Reeves and Eaker, cultural caring is a huge component of our work. Until next time, I'm Rob Meyer. Check out solutiontree.com for current publication, events, and information that will support your pursuit of excellence. Keep learning and have a wonderful day.